Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. On behalf of the Open Mosque, I want to welcome everyone to this third of our monthly special seminars. The first one dealt with racism and inequality. The second one dealt with coronavirus and impact on the Abrahamic communities. And now this third one, very important and topical, the issue of forgiveness. Do we forgive those who have hurt us or harmed us and others? And these are, of course, great moral questions of our day. We have four distinguished speakers. I will introduce them as they go along. The first speaker will be Rabbi Greg Alexander. He comes from Cape Town. In his 14 years as part of the rabbinical team at Temple Israel Cape Town, the largest progressive Jewish congregation in Africa, Rabbi Greg Alexander has helped build his community into a vibrant and growing hub of Jewish life in the African continent. Growing up in apartheid racist South Africa, he brings his lived experience of the transformation from minority rule to democracy and the challenges the country has faced since then to his Torah teaching and social activism. As a master educator, Rabbi Greg has lived and taught in Jewish communities from England to Israel, Hungary to Russia, and the USA to South Africa. He's particularly proud of his strong relationship with his community that his community has built up with the Open Mosque, including the annual Ramadan meal they share at the Temple Israel Synagogue and the yearly Hanukkah festival celebration held at the Open Mosque. Rabbi Greg is a graduate of the University of Cape Town, as well as the Leo Beck College in London. He currently lives in Cape Town with his wife, Andrea, herself a rabbinical student, and their 3 children. So Rabbi Greg, is up to you. I'm passing the baton on to you now, and you can select screen sharing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taj, and thank you for the welcome, and also thank you for the invitation to come and be together with everybody this evening. It's particularly appropriate in Jewish timing to talk about forgiveness now, because we are in the month, the Hebrew month of Elul. This is the lunar month that precedes Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. And it's a time that you are required to look at your own state of forgiveness, who it is that you have wronged and who it is that you need to fix your relationship with, and of course our relationship with God. So it's almost as if, Dr. Taj, you scripted this perfectly. So when the invitation came up in my email, I was very pleased to be part of this evening. So yeah, thank you very much for having me, and I'm going to begin my presentation now. So I think the first thing to understand is when people talk about sin, this big word sin, one of the important things to clear up in a Jewish understanding of sin is that Jewish tradition doesn't understand human perfections as being the result of an original sin by Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. In fact, the opposite is true, that we are born with a pure soul. In fact, sin is, it's a fact of life. It's something that happens, but it's not something that necessarily has to be part of a person's life from birth. It's really about their actions and the choices that they make. So we understand that sin is the result of a tussle that is going on within us. We have 2 inclinations, known as in Hebrew as the Yetzer. What it is that we are doing is a result of a struggle that goes on within us. There is the Yetzer Hara, which is the inclination to do evil, and there is the Yetzer HaTov, which is the inclination to do good. And really the challenge of life is how to live in balance. So if we have the Yetzer Hara dominant, then we are going to be tugged towards actions that are not good in the world. If we have the Yetzer HaTov dominant, then we will be pulled towards doing good in this world. So I know what your question is going to be. Why would God create us with a Yetzer Hara at all? Surely if the Yetzer Hara, just by its term, the evil inclination, why would God place an evil inclination into human beings? If we are made in the divine image, if we are made in the image of God, why would we even have this, this inclination built within us? And I suppose that's the difference between us and angels. So angels' job every day is to do good. They need to serve God and do exactly what God needs of them. God says, angel, I want you to go there. Yes, I'm off. I want you to do this. Yes, I'm off. Angels praise God all day. God, you look wonderful. What a beautiful tie you're wearing today. It matches the color of your shoes perfectly. And that is the job of angels. Human beings are more complicated. So we have this Yetzer Hara and this Yetzer HaTov. And what is the purpose of the Yetzer Hara? Well, there is a purpose. In the Jewish understanding, there's a discussion of this in the Talmud, in rabbinic literature, where a rabbi called Nachman comes to explain why in Genesis chapter 1, at the end of the creation of the world, God looks around, Vaya Elohim et kol asher asa v'hinei tov ma'od. God says, God looks around and looks at the creation after humanity has been created as the pinnacle of creation, and God says it is very good. And the question is, why does it say very good? Why not just good? Why very good? And according to this Rabbi Nachman, this refers, the very good refers to, the first good is just the Yetzer HaTov, the good inclination, but the very good is to the Yetzer Hara. But hold on a second, how can the Yetzer Hara be very good? So Rabbi Nachman in the Talmud says, if it wasn't for the Yetzer Hara, a person would not build a home, a man would not marry a woman, they wouldn't have children, they wouldn't engage in business. So what is the purpose of the Yetzer Hara? Well, build a home, get married, have children, engage in business. These are not things that are, so to speak, good. These are things that are challenging. When you see someone and you are attracted to them romantically or sexually, this is very challenging. And if you were just walking around all day going, life is good, everything is fine, I don't need anything because everything is wonderful, this is a Garden of Eden here, why would we want to marry? Why would we want to have children? Why would we need homes? Why would we need businesses? Why would we challenge ourselves to be more, want more, do more, if everything was already good? So this is where the Yetzer Hara comes into play, and this is why we have a problem with sin. So let's talk about the word sin in the Jewish understanding. We've established that we are not born in sin. So what is sin? Sin is a byproduct of God's decision to create us with free will. So you can blame that one on God. Thank God for that one. We get to choose. We are choosing people. We have been created with a free will. And sometimes we choose well, and sometimes we choose less well. And that's where sin comes into play. So there are many words for sin. It's like snow. If you live in a place where you need lots of words for snow, Judaism understands that there are lots of ways that we make mistakes. The one that's most often used is the word chet. And it's interesting. If we study it, we can learn a lot about a Jewish opinion of sin. So the word chet literally means something that goes astray. And the example that the rabbis talk about is an arrow that misses the mark. So if you're in the Hunger Games and you're trying to shoot your arrow and it misses the target, this is what it is. It's a missed target. It's not a permanent failure of your life. An archer can keep trying to get the arrows closer to the target, and ultimately, hopefully we'll get it to the center. So there's no guarantee of immediate success, and nor does success ensure that the goal will be reached in all subsequent attempts. But we know that sometimes we miss the mark. And that is the concept of sin. Does it leave an indelible stain on your soul? No, or not necessarily. We'll talk about that in a moment. Because Judaism understands that we have a very useful tool in our toolbox, and this is something called teshuvah. Sorry for all the Hebrew terms, I just wanted people to understand. So what's teshuvah and how does it work? Teshuvah literally means an answer. It's often translated as repentance. It comes from the root that means to return or come back. So if I ask a question, I get an answer. The answer comes back. But in the case of teshuvah, teshuvah understands that sometimes when we have missed the mark with our arrow, if we do this again and again, we actually find that our path in life goes away from the good path, from walking the path that is good for us as human beings. And we need to come back. And that's the idea of teshuvah, coming back. And the main person who explained and taught about teshuvah is one that has a great common heritage to Jews and Muslims, and that is Maimonides, known to Muslims by his Arabic name Ibn Maimun. He lived in the 12th century in Spain and Egypt. He was born in Cordoba. But he is probably the greatest medieval Jewish philosopher. He became one of the most prolific and influential Torah scholars of the Middle Ages. He was also a preeminent astronomer and a physician. He was appointed as the court physician to the Grand Vizier Al-Qadi Al-Fadil and to Sultan Saladin. So he was a very prominent leader both within the Jewish and the Muslim community in 12th century in Spain and Egypt. And figures prominently in the history of Islamic and Arab sciences. And what does he say about teshuvah? Well, he says that teshuvah is a three-step process. Number one, you've done something wrong. First thing, stop. If you don't stop, you can't do teshuvah. So if you have done an action and that is continuous, desist, stop the activity. Number two, confession, remorse, restitution. If you don't admit that you have done something wrong, if you don't admit that there is a problem in the way that you conduct your life, if you don't feel sorry about this, and if you don't work to restore what it is that you've done wrong, then you cannot do teshuvah. And the third step, once you have done these, is to then go to the person that you've harmed and to ask for forgiveness. So I think if we hold on to these three steps, it's going to be a very useful formula for us to understand whether or not somebody is deserving of forgiveness. What that means is that yes, everyone can potentially gain forgiveness. That's the good news. What it says is no, you can't have easy forgiveness. So around this time of year, I will tend to get a whole lot of emails and Facebook posts from people in the Jewish community saying, the high holy days are coming, that's the Jewish New Year. If I have hurt you in any way, please forgive me. And these, I have to say, I do not respond, thank you very much. Because this is incomplete forgiveness. This is easy forgiveness. I'm really sorry if I've hurt you, please forgive me. No, I'm sorry. Maimonides says there is a process. You don't do the process, you're not worthy of the forgiveness. In history, we can think of many examples, and the South African one, because I grew up under apartheid, that jumps to mind, is one of my personal heroes and spiritual mentors, is Bishop Desmond Tutu, who led with great distinction the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was tasked with providing a vehicle for processing the crimes of apartheid. And the primary object of that inquiry after apartheid was abolished on the rule books was to allow people to come and testify, whether they were victims or perpetrators, and to try in some way to heal the wounds of hatred or anger that had been created by the apartheid system. But what's important about the TRC is that the TRC did not create a vehicle for bringing the perpetrators to trial. It was a forum where people could speak if the government chose to act on that information, they could, but there was no guarantee that that was happened. And Tutu was one of the, as the chairman of the commission, was one of those who guided people who came to bring testimony to say that, I'm quoting a couple of quotations, one who forgives becomes a better person than the one being consumed by anger and hatred. If you can find it in yourself to forgive, then you are no longer chained to the perpetrator. You can move on, and you can even help the perpetrator to become a better person too. And these are beautiful ideas, but they do not, in my opinion, my humble opinion, they do not equate to a process of teshuvah, because they do not require the perpetrator to go through the steps that we saw Maimonides describing before. So, I want to refine what that forgiveness involves. Basic forgiveness, the most basic concept of forgiveness in Judaism is the concept of mechila. And what mechila says is that you forego the perpetrator's indebtedness to the victim. So it's a simple mathematical tool to say you owe me a debt because of your action, and I forego that debt. So it's like a pardon granted to a criminal by the modern state. It's not that the criminal didn't do the crime remains, just the debt is forgiven. You no longer owe me anything else, I forgive you. And obviously this is assuming that teshuvah has already been done. That's the basic level of mechila, and it requires genuine teshuvah from the perpetrator. So let's take the case of Morris and Gladys. They're a married couple. Morris, God forbid, physically or emotionally abuses his wife Gladys, but Morris desperately loves her and he wants to change. He goes and he does deep work on himself. He gets help, he gets support. He vows to Gladys never to hurt her again, and he puts into place in his life checks and balances to help him to never do this. He goes to Gladys and he says, Gladys, I've done all of this work. I love you. I really ask for your forgiveness. Gladys can choose. She has to decide, in her opinion, has Morris done appropriate teshuvah? And if she decides that he has, she forgoes Morris's debt by forgiving him. So the crime remains. He was an abusive husband, which is a terrible crime, but she has chosen to forgive him and to allow him to move forward, and then possibly to move forward as a couple. A deeper level of forgiveness is the concept of slicha, and this is where one actually opens your heart in empathy to the person. You reach a deep understanding of the perpetrator. You achieve empathy because of their trouble. You believe that their tshuva is genuine. Again, it's not a reconciliation or embracing of the offender of their offense. It's simply reaching the conclusion that this offender too, as a human being, a frail human being, is deserving of your sympathy or empathy. And I guess it's something like an act of mercy. So in the case of Gladys, if a woman was abused by a man, it's possible that she would never reach this level of forgiveness. Even if she chooses to forgive, she may remain at mechila and not move to slicha at all, and she's certainly not obliged to do that, nor is it morally necessary for her to do so. The deepest and the third and final level is called kapara. And kapara is what we translate as atonement. This is the ultimate forgiveness. It is a total wiping away of sin. It's an existential cleansing, and this is only granted by God. No human being can atone the sin of another. No human being can purify or wipe out the spiritual pollution of another person. This is something that can only be done by God. So let's pull this all together. Why does sin happen? Well, you have inside you a good inclination, which is the extension of you being made in the divine image. That is pure, it's untainted, you're not born in sin, that is your essence. You also have this Yetzer Hara, this inclination to evil, which is there to challenge you, to stimulate your powers, and to enable there to be balanced in your life, good and evil, so that you can exercise free choice and make good actions and right choices that are meaningful and deserving of reward. We're not robots, we're not on autopilot. We need to actively choose the good. If we make a mistake, if we miss the mark, there is a clear process whereby we can do teshuvah. And if we do that appropriately and we ask for forgiveness, it would be appropriate for the person, the victim of your transgressions, to consider forgiveness. And that's where I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Rabbi Greg. Could you just the screen? So that was the first presented for tonight. All questions will be entertained at the end of the 4 presentations. So those of you who want to ask questions of Rabbi Greg and any of the other speakers, make notes as we go along, so that when the question and answer session arrives, you'll be well placed to do that. We come now to our second speaker, which is from the Republic of Georgia. We are very pleased to have one of the first female clerics in the Republic of Georgia. So we have Reverend Rushadan Kostiridze, who's a bishop of the Evangelical Baptist Church of Georgia. She's the first woman in that former Soviet country to be ordained as bishop, and is a long-term researcher of women's ordination practices in different Christian traditions. She holds a master's degree in Christian theology and has studied feminist theology at Ilia State University and Sabah University in Tbilisi, Georgia. Apart from her ecclesiastical responsibilities, Bishop Rushadan is a gender expert, researcher, and trainer. She has campaigned actively against gender violence, for women's equality, and for LGBT rights. Bishop Rushadan was granted in 2014 an International Woman of Courage Award by the US State Department that was handed to her by Barack Obama's wife, Michelle. 2 years later, in 2016, Bishop Rushadan received the Order of Honor from the President of Georgia. So, with great pleasure, we have Bishop Rushadan to talk to us.
So hello everybody. I do not have a presentation because I prefer to speak when I don't depend on technological items. So I decided just to speak. When I was asked to speak about forgiveness, the very first thing I started to think was, what is the anatomy of forgiveness? How does the process of forgiveness look like? So I kind of draw a picture of forgiveness to myself. So there must be some act of wrongdoing. There are victims, or primary victims or secondary victims, and sometimes secondary victims would suffer even more severely than the primary ones. So there are victims, there are results of this wrongdoing, wounds, pain, injustice, and at the end of the long process or short process or whatever, there is this something that requires a punishment. So, and here comes the forgiveness. So instead of punishment, we have mercy. So thanks to forgiveness, we can have mercy. Psychologists define forgiveness as conscious, deliberate decision to release feelings of resentment or vengeance toward a person or group of people, regardless who has harmed you, regardless of whether they actually deserved forgiveness or not. And what is very important, it's very interesting to know what is forgiveness, and equally important is to know what is not forgiveness. And psychologists say that forgiveness is not to diminish or deny the seriousness of offense against you. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. and nor does it mean excusing or justifying the offense. And though the forgiveness can help to repair the damaged relationships, it does not obligate you to reconcile with the person who harmed you or release them from the legal accountability. So this is kind of structure of forgiveness in a secular understanding. Probably the most frequently recited verses from scripture would be about forgiveness. And the Lord's Prayer, which every Christian knows by heart, and the very first verse that comes to your mind when we start the prayer is the Lord's Prayer, which consists of 7 petitions, and in the 5th petition we constantly repeat this very interesting formula. We say, and Lord, we forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. It comes in the Gospel of Matthew. Later, Matthew explains what he says. So, for if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. Later, again, Matthew says, but if you do not forgive others who sin against you, your heavenly Father will not forgive you. Luke speaks about the forgiveness. Do not judge and you will not be judged. Do not condemn and you will not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. In Matthew, we have even a very interesting kind of calculation about forgiveness when the apostle Peter comes to Jesus to ask you, how many times are we supposed to forgive our brother or sister? Is it about 7 times a day as the law is required by the law? But Jesus says, not 7 times, but 7 times 70, which I calculated, it comes 490 times a day. Very interesting formula. Once I remember there was a debate about the Christian values in international politics on state level, and one of the speakers who was my opponent said that Christian values, and especially the where it's about forgiveness and issues how to deal with the enemy, probably works very well on a personal level, but on the social level, on the state level, on the international level, it would be a disaster for any country. And he started reciting the very interesting verse from the scripture, again from Matthew, from the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus explains the forgiveness and gives how forgiveness can be translated into everyday life. And here he says, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. That's what we heard that is written. And Christians, I just want to add that we Christians are very keen to speak how better our Christian theology is than, for instance, Old Testament theology. And here we have the how Jesus explains that, oh, you have in this Old Testament, in Law of Moses, that eye for an eye, but I tell you, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Yeah, of course, if this is the formula of how to deal with the offense, then we have a problem here. For instance, my country, Georgia, 20% of the Georgian territory is occupied by Russia. So how can we translate these verses into everyday life? For instance, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other as well. So probably if Russians are killing our sons in a battlefield where we're supposed to bring our daughters to rape them or kill them. And the second statement would be, if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. So if we understand clearly, if 20% is taken by Russians, for instance, if Abkhazia or Tskhinvali region is taken, then let's give them Poti, Kutaisi, Gori region, central part of Georgia. So probably here is something what I found for myself. So there are two absolutely different dynamics of offense or perpetration. One is when there is violence, and the second one is when there is a conflict. Violence is when the powers and forces are absolutely different, and conflict is absolutely different dynamics. Conflict is when two equals are fighting together and they're harming each other equally, and they both bear the equal responsibility of forgiveness, of dealing with the wounds and everything. There is a very interesting scholar, his name was Walter Wink. He's an American theologian and human rights activist, and he kind of drew a very interesting understanding of the passage. He said that how to convert this violence into a conflict dynamic, so then that we can deal with the problem on equal levels. For instance, he says, when it's about them turning the other cheek, he says that it's all about to subvert the power structures of the time. So turning the other cheek, that is perpetrator is faced with a dilemma. They cannot use the left hand, it's only the right hand they can use. So to beat with somebody in one cheek, and if the victim turns the other cheek, then it does not look like the violence anymore, but it looks like a conflict, because slapping with the open arm, it means the conflict of two equals. Or if about handling the cloak issue, the debtor has given a shirt off, so he's kind of left without any clothes. And in Hebrew tradition, probably you will agree with me, the nakedness is viewed not just the shame for the one who is naked, but the shame for the viewers. So in this situation, it's again the dynamic of the power dynamic is changed from the violence into conflict. So it's not only me who is in the diminished position, but both of us. But the shame is on me and on you as well. Very often, in relationship with people, in relationship with countries. It's very important to understand what the forgiveness really means. It's not forgetting that something has never happened. It's like I had a wound from the car accident. In first couple of months, the wound was very painful, and it required care and special care. It was bleeding, ugly to look at. Later on, it was not that painful, but it was very ugly. And as every time the weather would change, I could feel the pain in my arm. Later on, the pain would disappear and the ugliness would disappear. But every time I would look at the wound, it was still there. It was part of myself. So probably the forgiveness would be something like that, that it will not go away. It will always be there, because as psychologists say, forgiveness does not mean that, that you forget what happened. You remember. But it remains the part of your life and your experience. The problem is sometimes those who are in a victim position very often kind of make this victim identity as their own identity, and never want they don't want to give up. And, oops, God bless. Every time there is attempt to turn in the violence into a conflict, or turn the to convert, to change the power position into the equal position, the victims would try to remain in a victim position. Or there can be situations when people who are perpetrators try to forget what had happened previously, like the history has never happened. So let's start from the clean page, or the new page. But it can never start with a new page, because if the violence has never been turned into the conflict, and the conflict was not dealt in a proper way with forgiveness and with dealing and sharing what had happened, that will never go away. So at some point I was told that Christian forgiveness can work on a personal level, but it does not work on a social or the state level. I would say that no, if the understanding is that you just decide to forget everything, then it does not work on a personal level either. I have seen for instance, I have seen the ruined families, the victim women who are victims of domestic violence, who we are told to forget like it had never happened. It does not work. It doesn't work for the families, for children, and neither works for the society. And I wanted to bring the example of the regime of apartheid, how people, that's the most remarkable example of forgiveness for the rest of the world, because people who decided to move on, they did not carry the identity of victims, or they did not carry the bars or cells of the prison with themselves while they were in the freedom. So they decided to talk about it and to deal with the problem on equal platform. So when Jesus was interrogated by the high priest, there is this very interesting story. He he's asked about his teaching, and he answers that I've never taught in secret. People have witnessed what I've preached, and you can ask them. The guard of the temple got very angry because he decided that it was not the proper tone to talk to the high priest, and he started to beat him up. And Jesus turned to him, and he didn't say that, oh, here is my another chicken, please beat me again. But he said, if I am saying something wrong, prove. And if you cannot prove, why are you beating me? So this is the situation when Jesus turned the violence into a conflict stage, when he became on the equal level with the guard. So the guard was asked to prove why he is doing what he is doing. So probably the forgiveness, unless there is a justice, unless there is the opportunity for the victim to speak, to prove about his or her situation, there is no forgiveness. There is no peace without justice, and there is no forgiveness without justice. And justice is not merely to replace the punishment with mercy, but forgiveness is to go through all these stages. And it's very similar what Rabbi Greg was explaining from the Jewish tradition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bishop Rusudan, for illuminating perspective from the Christian point of view. And I'm sure there will be questions directed at and for Bishop Rusudan. Now, our third speaker is a dear friend and colleague of mine, Sheikh Begum Mustafa, who hails from Scotland. Begum Mustafa has been a thorn in the flesh of the Orthodox Sunni clergy for many, many years. He's one of the few Muslim intellectuals who actually has a fatwa leveled against him in 2001 by the clergy in Scotland because of his defense of Salman Rushdie and other matters expounding the Quranic perspective of Islam rather than the traditional Orthodox ultra-conservatism. He's written fairly extensively, published many books and articles, but his most wonderful magnum opus is what was published 4 years ago in 2016, which is a modern translation of the Quran. For those of you who want to have a really a fascinating modern day translation with contemporary perspectives of the Holy Quran, you can do no worse than get hold of Begum Mustafa's brilliant translation. It's available on Amazon and also from his own website as well. Sheikh Begum and myself are also colleagues. We have started last year the Oxford Institute for British Islam. In other words, it's a think tank dedicated to creating Islam or promoting an Islam that is relevant and rooted to the United Kingdom, not to Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or Yemen, but an Islam that's at home in a Western society like the United Kingdom. So it gives me great pleasure to ask him now to give his presentation from the Islamic perspective on the concept of clemency, compassion, and forgiveness.
Good evening. Thank you, Dr. Taj, and for inviting me. It's good to meet new friends and share some interesting views. Now, I did do a small PowerPoint presentation, but my technology is not my greatest, strongest point either. So I'm going to forego that, and I'm just going to speak about the subject in hand. So, and I think I'll make it as interesting as possible without the help of our PowerPoint presentation. And I also appreciate that many people have joined to listen and would like to thank them too. The question we have been asked is, what does each of the great Abrahamic beliefs teach about pardoning those who have harmed or damaged society, your family, yourselves, and the environment. We have heard some interesting perspectives from Rabbi Greg and Bishop Rusudan. So should forgiveness be unconditional? And do the present day communities have responsibility for what the previous generation did and from which they benefited? This month, Japan marked the 75th anniversary of the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The United States, with the blessings of the United Kingdom, detonated nuclear weapons over the two cities, killing almost 250,000 people, mostly civilians. History is replete with such atrocities. The Native American civilization was decimated by the European invaders. The Aborigines in Australia suffered a similar fate. The Belgians, the Dutch, and the British wreaked havoc in the African continent. Many communities have suffered. The Jews in Germany, the Rohingyas in Myanmar, the Uyghurs in China, and the list goes on. Most of us know about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa, but there are other tragedies that took place over long periods and years ago and were dealt with in a similar fashion. For example, the Canadian TRC looked at the residential schools that were part of the Canadian system to weaken and break the cultural and family ties of the Indigenous people. Then there are many children today, descendants of slaves of a bygone time, but yet they are still paying recompense for their freedom to the children of their former colonial masters. These injustices can still be discovered in the Caribbean islands, where slaves 200 years ago were compelled to buy their own freedom, and their children are still paying today. But there will be no Truth and Reconciliation Commission for them. Also, there are many injustices of the past and present that need to be brought out into the open. But unfortunately, the time and remit we have today will not allow that. The questions we have been asked to address is that should people of today show some remorse for the injustices that have been visited on by previous generations? And should reparations be paid to the descendants of those who suffered, perhaps for hundreds of years? Earlier today in the news, I heard the father of a victim of the Christchurch shooting say that he will never forgive the killer of his child. Is unconditional forgiveness a release, or is it the absence of true justice? What does the Quran say about forgiveness and pardoning of wrongs that have been visited on populations around the world? The Quran's view is from the position of providing justice, and for this reason, we need to look at how the Quran guides to protect us from the wrongs of others and the wrongs that we impose on ourselves. The general consensus among traditionalists is that the word Ghafur in Arabic means forgiveness, but that's not what the Quran says. The word for forgiveness in the Quran is afu, which is to pardon somebody unconditionally. So since Ghafur is mentioned some 238 times and afu is mentioned about 35 times, I will not be going into great detail about either of these words or quoting all the verses. We just don't have the time here. Quoting many verses only shows what the verses say about without expansion. This may not be helpful. It is much better, in this case at least, to understand the concept in relation to the subject under discussion. Yes, the Quran speaks about compassion, but equally importantly, it also speaks about justice. And Ghafur, in fact, means protection, and this can be understood through the law of requital. The law is really about the consequences of one's actions, whether the actions took place today, yesterday, or a few hundred years ago. Once understood, you will see its importance in relation to the protection or the pardon of ill conduct of individuals or societies. The few atrocities I quoted earlier are the consequences of not being aware of this law. Not only is awareness of this law crucial, unless you understand this law, you cannot manage it. While there is room for unconditional forgiveness, the Quran in the main speaks about protection from incurring lasting harm to both individuals and societies. The harm is not only that which is inflicted on others, but that which occurs to the individual who actually perpetrates the crime, and also the harm caused to those not directly involved. This has to be understood in a much wider context, because society faces harm on a much greater scale than can normally be seen, and bad things do happen to good people too. We know the manifestation of evil is nothing except the consequences of those who watch without doing anything to stop it from happening. In these circumstances, wickedness percolates through society and affects even those who have done nothing wrong, except, as the saying goes, that they have done nothing at all. So what does the Quran say? Compassion and unconditional forgiveness is something God does when he overlooks our misdemeanors and gives us time to repent. The Quran speaks about responsibility and accountability. This is what the law of requital is about, the consequences of action. This is especially important as those who have committed the crime may have died a long time ago. So how do we reconcile that? The Quran shows examples of where wrong has been done in the past, but there is no atonement for previous wrongs, only direction to change the ways we behave now. Repentance is about taking steps to ensure any harm done is eliminated with positive action, as it is the good deeds that rescind the bad deeds. The Quranic concept of the law of requital raises a very important questions. Humans are emotional in reaction, but this law is strictly based on justice, which has no room for emotion. So the key point for consideration is whether there is any place for forgiveness or mercy. We cannot directly blame people today for what their forefathers may have done many centuries ago. However, people become responsible when they realize that they have benefited from a crime, and it is then they need to take restorative action. Let me extrapolate this with an example. Anyone who knows the history of food and drink in Europe will be familiar with how this trade developed through slavery. Although slavery in Britain officially ended in 1833, but the beverages and much of the food introduced was the consequences of slave labor. Some of this activity continues to this day, although we may not call it slave labor anymore. Now, we can blame the slave traders who started the industry of tea, coffee, sugar, cocoa, tobacco, all of which began with the tragedy of slavery. This was and still is driven by the money to be made, but then perpetuated by the addiction and demand in Europe for these products. The common people as consumers became by default a part of this gruesome trade. This makes most of us complicit by default in the crime of slavery. Had there been no demand, ever increasing demand for sugar, tea, or tobacco, there may not have been the need for ever increasing number of slaves. So should I atone for the slave trade because I drink tea or indulge in the occasional bottle of rum? Famous individuals then as now played a part in the trade. Handel, the famous classical composer, invested in the slave trade. So should I atone for the slave trade because I enjoyed Messiah or the water music? Before we hold today's generation responsible for historical sins, we need to think about the history and let history be a lesson. And we need to think about justice, not just forgiveness. So what are the things we can learn from the Quran? While we must always show compassion, and at times we need to overlook the wrong that has been done, we must always take responsibility for our actions, enriching ourselves with the permanent values from the Quran. We must show accountability for our own actions, managing the law of requital. We must practice equivalence. This is not the law of equivalence as in physics, but as in economics. The term the Quran uses is asan, which means creating a balance of wealth in society. Where damage has been done, then that harm must be repaired. Taking positive steps to redress the imbalance is a healing process. This leads to the protection that the Quran speaks of when using the word Ghafur. While unconditional forgiveness may be desirable, the Quran decrees progressive steps to restore justice, to nurture and strengthen the spirit, to protect us from the harm and protect us from doing harm, because prevention is better than cure. We cannot and should not punish today's generation for things that happened in the past, but we should use history as a lesson and balance society so that these tragedies do not continue or happen again. The Quran makes it a duty for all to check and to do as much as we can to stop such acts that cause harm to society. We may not be able to directly hold to account those who actually commit atrocities, but if we can do something to redress the imbalance and injustices that still exist, then we have fulfilled our responsibility. Looking at the bigger picture, who do we blame and from whom do we seek compensation and reparation? Because we may all be complicit in some way in the tragedies that befall our communities. If you have enjoyed a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or bought a bar of chocolate, we may owe a debt to those who have suffered so that today we can enjoy these luxuries. A world that continues sees fear and turmoil, yet does nothing to alleviate the cause, is at odds with its claim that it truly wants to create a cohesive society. We must remember that there will be no peace and security in the world until those who do not suffer are just as outraged as those who do. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Sheikh Begum. I'm sure that there will be others There will be many questions following your rather provocative and interesting presentation. Now we come to the final speaker for tonight before we have a 1 hour question and answer session. I can just get this right.
Sorry, I think I was working at the same time you were, so forgive me for that.
Okay. All right. So our final speaker for tonight is Dr. Smith Bryce, who's Dean of the College of Professional Studies at Bowie State University in Maryland, United States. Previously, she was the Dean of Education, Health and Human Sciences at the Benedict College in Columbia, South Carolina. Dr. Smith Bryce has served on the faculties of the University of South Carolina, Abilene Christian University, and Baylor University in Texas. Her research centers on addressing issues of structural violence, specifically as it relates to African Americans. Publications focus on the development of the social welfare system by African American women and documents structural barriers inhibiting African American family units. Dr. Smith Bryce provides professional expertise to community organizations, religious institutions, and educational organizations on the social impact on African American families. She has taught and lectured throughout the United States, as well as in Ghana, Sweden, Uganda, Colombia, and the Republic of Moldova. So the floor is now yours, Dr. Smith Bryce.
Okay, let me.
Screen share, yeah. Mm-hmm.
There we go. Let's see. There we go. All right, well, I am very honored to be here today with each of you. Just so that the audience is aware, I am the one non-theologian that's on this panel. And I was really a bit intimidated by the request to be on the panel. But as I listened to the three previous presenters, the creator made it very clear to me how all of this fits. So I think my presentation will be more of a case study that might be able to help us answer the question, particularly from the three various perspectives. I would agree with several of the previous presenters who stated something along the lines about forgiveness at the individual level is different than forgiveness at the institutional level or societal level. I want to start with a quote from a very dear friend, Baba Derek Jackson, who said this just before we were going live, and I just thought this is exactly what I think helps us with this, that forgiveness cannot absolve one in regard to depraved indifference when it is committed with malice or with forethought. And so I want to ask that you follow along with me as I explore this concept. So records indicate that the first Africans arrived here in what is now known as the United States of America in August 1619. Between 20 to 30 Africans arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia, where they were sold to English colonists into the institution of chattel slavery. It is through this institution that is what is now known as the United States of America. This institution is what built this country. The wealth realized by this country is on the backs of the free labor of those Africans who were kidnapped and forced into slavery. It is in this context that I engage in this discourse about the concept of forgiveness and unconditional clemency. I recognize that the exploitation of African labor is a global issue, as Sheikh just reminded us, but I'm choosing to focus on the impact of this issue on Blacks in the United States of America, and if there can be this thing called true forgiveness and unconditional clemency in our current state. And I just want to remind us that we can't really talk about forgiveness without talking about reconciliation. From 1619 to 1865, the institution of chattel slavery became the economic driving force for the U.S. South fueling the industrial US North and Britain. This institution produced tobacco, rice, indigo, sugar, and cotton, making the US one of the industrial powers of that day. This was a result of forced labor through the use of torture and other forms of violence. A recent article published in the Journal of Human Genetics on August 6, 2020, entitled Genetic Consequences of the Transatlantic Slave Trade in the Americas, confirmed not only the physical violence, but also the sexual violence inherent of the institution of chattel slavery. This article found that there's DNA evidence that supports the rape of enslaved African women by white enslavers as a means of producing more bodies for free labor that then fuels the US economy. Out of slavery and the anti-Black racism it required grew nearly everything that has truly made America exceptional: its economic might, its industrial power, its electoral system, its diet and popular music, the inequalities of its public health and education, its astonishing penchant for violence, its income inequality, the example it sets for the world as a land of freedom and equality, its slang, its legal system, and the endemic racial fears and hatreds that continue to plague it to this day. One would be tempted to believe that the ending of the institution of chattel slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution would really be the end of the story, but we know that it is not. One of my favorite scriptures that I like to quote regularly, particularly in the times that we're living in the context of what's going on now, is from Isaiah 10, 1 and 2. Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people, making widows their prey and robbing the fatherless. And I think that this is an appropriate theme for post-1865 through today. So what are some of these unjust laws that still impact us today? So right after 1865, there was a creation of laws of the land that we call Jim Crow laws, but there were these Black codes that were in place to govern the bodies of the formerly enslaved. Some of these Black codes were things like race was defined by blood. The presence of any amount of Black blood made one Black. Or employment was required of all freedmen. Any violators faced vagrancy charges. And those vagrancy charges could then lead them to be put into what then became the beginnings of our penitentiary systems. So we didn't have statewide penitentiary systems prior to the emancipation of enslaved Africans that came from the 13th Amendment. In fact, there's a clause in the 13th Amendment that I'll mention a little bit later on that basically says that the only way that folks can be enslaved is if they're duly convicted of a crime. And so the crime of sitting somewhere or standing somewhere or just being Black was enough to put folks into the system of our prison systems. Another Black code that I think is interesting is that freedmen, so these are formerly enslaved Africans, could not assemble without the presence of a white person. Another code was that freedmen were assigned to be agricultural workers and their duties and hours were tightly regulated. So there's a list of these codes that, that each state developed to govern the bodies of these formerly enslaved Africans. We can move a little bit further along if we talk about the Social Security Act of 1935, which was done at a time where, you know, we were coming through our Great Depression. Franklin Delano Roosevelt has been championed as, with the New Deal, that this is how we got out of that economic disaster. And also his policies were used in the ways in which we continue to colonize the rest of the world. And so the Social Security Act of 1935 was enacted to provide unemployment benefits and old age pensions for US citizens. However, what's explicit about this policy is that it excluded domestic laborers and agricultural workers. So remember when I was talking about the Black codes earlier, those Black codes relegated formerly enslaved folks to the roles of domestic workers and agricultural laborers. So in essence, this Social Security Act actually excluded the formerly enslaved Africans, Black folks. So this is yet another example of unjust laws that were intended to maintain continued oppression of Black folks in the US. And it doesn't stop there. In the 1930s, as well as part of this New Deal that Franklin Delano Roosevelt cabinet put together, there was the Federal Housing Administration, which created loan programs to help make home ownership accessible to more Americans. Home ownership is important because this is the source of wealth, the largest source of wealth for Americans, is the ability to own a home. The government created color-coded maps, green for good neighborhoods, red for bad neighborhoods, to determine who got these loans. So as you might imagine, many neighborhoods were designated as red because Blacks and other people of color lived there. That was it, only because Black folks lived in these communities. So this process became known as redlining, which systematically prevented them from not only getting home loans, but also encouraged developers in green areas to explicitly discriminate against non-whites. So we saw different communities that came up with homeowner agreements where they said only white folks could live in this community, only the realtors would only take non-white folks to certain communities, wouldn't make it available. Folks wouldn't even know. And so there were people who did things. One of our US congressmen, Senator Cory Booker, currently talks about how his family had to use a white friend to actually buy a house for them to pretend like he was Cory Booker's father in order to get through this. So this is not a long, long time ago. This is what we're currently still dealing with. So this led, this being blocked out of this wealth that's inherent with home ownership, led households of color into wealth-stripping land contracts where they were paid exorbitant prices for homes that could be easily loaned out to white folks. These kinds of policies resulted in 98% of home loans going to white families from 1934 to 1962. Not only did the ability to purchase homes give whites the ability to accrue wealth, it also attracted new businesses to those neighborhoods, which increased property values and allowed those homeowners access to other wealth building vehicles like going to college. As a result, wealth in the white communities compounded and passed on from generation to generation. These policies have evolved. While redlining is not technically in practice, the monitoring of this practice has just been repealed by the current president of the US. So as of a few weeks ago, there is not even a monitoring process for this. Home ownership is the primary source of wealth in this country. The lack of wealth still prevented minorities from moving up to the green neighborhoods and kept communities separated by race. Additionally, certain structures like the racially skewed criminal justice system and the tax code favoring the rich continue to contribute to this wealth divide today. The compounding effects of these types of laws have led to the wealth chasm that now exists. Even now, these effects are felt between otherwise similar families of different races. According to the Economic Policy Institute, the typical Black family with a graduate or professional degree lagged behind its white counterpart in wealth by more than $200,000, and I'll show you some of that data. So my question is, what exactly are we forgiving, and to what end? So in this slide, we can see a bit more of what this racial divide looks like. because descendants of enslaved people are still left out of the US economic system. You will see from this chart that we have the least amount of wealth in this very wealthy country. The current COVID-19 pandemic has revealed that we are also more likely to be considered essential workers that support this economy. So our role as essential workers supporting this kind of economy still is maintained to this day, but as you can see, we're least likely to benefit from this economy. We also see that for every $100 in white family wealth, Black families hold just $5.04. More than 1 in 4 Black households have 0 or negative net worth, compared to less than 1 in 10 white households without wealth. And we also see that between 1983, I'm sorry, I'm trying to read this with, this is covering my screen, there we go. Between 1983 and 2013, the wealth of the median Black household declined 75%, from $6,800 to $1,700. At the same time, wealth for the median white household increased 14%, from $102,000 to $116,800. And one might be led to believe that maybe this is because, you know, white folks tend to be more highly educated, they're making more money, they have more income, that could be an explanation for this, but I'm afraid not. We can see from this data that attainment does not diminish the wealth gap. So it's not about the income that folks are making, it is more about the wealth that they're able to retain and build upon. So you'll see that, you know, a Black family with an advanced degree will make less money than a white family. I mean, less than half of what a white family would make with a 4-year degree. You see the differences here in as it relates to wealth. The wealth of a Black family with a high school head of household with a high school diploma or GED, with a wealth of $100 versus whites with $64,200. And so, you know, there's some serious issues here as it relates to the development of wealth that's been based on particular policies that are in place here in the United States of America. And these policies are unapologetically race-based. So when we ask the question about forgiveness, you know, as I stated earlier, forgiveness must include reconciliation and reparations. There have been several displays of forgiveness by African Americans directly after enduring a horrific event in recent times. For example, after the 2015 assassination of 9 people at the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, many of the surviving family members expressed that they had given the murderer, that they had forgiven the murderer approximately 24 hours after the murders. Botham Joan, who is a worship leader at a Dallas, Texas church, actually was part of the faith tradition that I'm a part of, was murdered by a police officer while he was sitting in his home. At his trial, Joan's brother hugged the convicted murderer, expressing his forgiveness of this awful act. The act of forgiveness is important in the African American culture. It's a way of relieving oneself from the bondage of hatred and revenge. However, this forgiveness should not be mistaken for an absolution of the sinful act. And I really appreciated Rabbi Greg going through what forgiveness looks like in the Jewish tradition, because it kind of helped to provide some insight into the differences when listening to Bishop Rashidin about, you know, from the Christian perspective and looking at it from the Jewish perspective, that, you know, this is one of the things that we, as Black Americans, almost pride ourselves on, this sense of forgiveness, but I'm not sure we even have the right to do so. So there are many, many scriptures in the Bible about this concept of reparations. I've chosen to use this one from Numbers 5, 6, and 7 that say to the Israelites, and this is God speaking to Moses, Any man or woman who wrongs another in any way and so is unfaithful to the Lord is guilty and must confess the sin they have committed. They must make full restitution for the wrong they have done, add a fifth of the value to it, and give it all to the person they have wronged. And so reparations is not a very popular concept here in the US. And there's all kinds of theories that I have as to why that's the case. But another scripture that comes to mind when I see this is that from Proverbs 14:9, it says, "Fools mock at reparation, but among the upright there is favor." So as has been stated in previous presentations, that reparations can be defined as material and social repayment made as acknowledgement and restitution by an offending party to an aggrieved for wrongs done in order to repair the injuries, losses, or disadvantages caused by the wrong. William Darity at Duke University argues that reparation should have three aims. And these are very similar to what I believe Rabbi Greg spoke about earlier. That there should be an acknowledgement of the wrongs done, and that there should be payment for the wrongs done, and that this should provide closure for both parties. This notion of acknowledgement of wrongs done has not been done here. So we've not had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in the US, well, as it relates to formerly enslaved Africans. There have been efforts, there's been reparations that's been paid to those Japanese Americans who were in internment camps, placed in internment camps during World War II. There has been a minimal amount of reparations that's been done to Native Americans, but not where it needs to be. There's been, one of the most famous cases of reparations as it relates to this enslavement of Africans is that those who were slave owners received reparations for losing their slaves. So they received some reparations from the United States government, but there has not been any reparations that's been made for those who have suffered and continue to suffer as a result of the institution of chattel slavery here in the United States. So I'm not sure of this concept of unconditional clemency from a Christian perspective. As I said earlier, I am not a theologian. But what I do know is that the biblical text is clear about the repairing of the breach in relationships. My white brothers and sisters cannot have a true relationship with the Creator, nor with their Black brothers and sisters without making us whole. I look forward to discussing this more as we, get questions from the audience. But here's a few questions, a few scriptures that speak to this issue of reparations and forgiveness. And so I'm very excited, like I said, that I was invited to be a part of this presentation. I look forward to the further discussion that we may have as it relates to these issues.
Thank you, Dr. Smith-Bryce, for a very powerful presentation with very graphic slides and quotations to prod our memory. We now have an hour more or less of discussion. I'll invite questions from the audience. When you ask a question, please make sure your image is available so that everyone can see each other, because we don't do burqa or niqab participants here. This is not, even with coronavirus, each one needs to see each other's faces. So please respect that. And those who don't have their videos on will not be able to ask a question. Let me kick off and you ended up about unconditional clemency, and just a brief answer from each of the four of you. And for the benefit, especially of the latecomers, we have several people joining late for work reasons. Briefly then, what is your scripture, depending on your faith, your sacred scripture have to say, is there such a thing as unconditional clemency, pardoning, and forgiveness in your faith? So I'll start off with Rabbi Greg, just a few words on that question, then with Bishop Rusudan, then with Sheikh Begum, and then with Dr. Smith-Price.
Thanks, Dr. Taj. And I think it's pretty clear from my presentation that the answer to that is going to be no. But for those who weren't here, and I spoke first, I think that it's telling to look at the example of South Africa post-apartheid and the problems that we're dealing with today in society, which have just been exacerbated by the coronavirus, is that although there was a process put into place by the inspired leadership of 1994 in this country, has true healing happened in this country? Have the wounds of apartheid been healed? No. So the dream of a rainbow nation and that everybody would walk forward into the new South Africa has not been achieved. And part of the problem is because there is a perceived lack of justice. You can't have forgiveness without accountability. And I think that is where I would draw the line, absolutely.
Thank you. Bishop Rusuden, is there such a thing as unforgivable, unconditional, unqualified pardoning and clemency in the New Testament, in the Gospels?
The New Testament speaks about unconditional love from God, unconditional acceptance from God. But every time we speak about forgiveness, we see the process. So when there is a process, there are conditions of the process. So we humans, we need to go through the steps, and whether we are forgiving or others are forgiving us, this is a process. We cannot jump, we cannot cut the corners, and New Testament does not provide any scripture support that you can just jump over and everything will be okay tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. Sheikh Begum, the Islamic Quranic perspective.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, now, yes.
The answer has to be yes and no, because the Quran defines the two words which I spoke about, afu and maghfir. What the Quran says is, say for example, where there usury has been obtained in the past, that can be kept, but the person must not do it again. But if the crime is grievous enough, then obviously it's a different situation. And then to give unconditional forgiveness might mean that there's an absence of justice or a denial of justice. So it has to be a different process altogether, depending on what the actions are. For example, slavery, you can't say you can forgive people because there is still the effects of slavery happening today. And we must take that into consideration and level the field, for people who are living today.
Thank you. And then finally, Dr. Smith-Price, is there such a thing in your understanding from Christianity that of unconditional forgiveness?
Well, so the interesting thing about the remnants of slavery is that the way in which many descendants of African slaves in this country have even understood Christianity.
We seem to have lost Dr. Smith-Price. Maybe there's a problem in Maryland. Okay, let's, hopefully she comes back to us soon. Let's proceed. This is a technical issue from her side.
Can you hear me?
No.
Now, yes.
Go ahead.
That is so odd. Okay. So as I was saying is that as descendants of African slaves, our understanding of Christianity comes through the lens of the slave owner, right? The way in which we were even introduced to the concept of Christianity is through that lens. So this whole notion that we can actually forgive folks of atrocities against us and that is done is to benefit the slave owner and is to benefit the descendants of such even to this day. So I just find it quite interesting that even when thinking through all of this, that our lens is, that in itself is something that still needs reparations, because, you know, we don't even have an identity that is absent from that through the lens of slavery.
Okay, thank you. I don't know how this discussion, so I'm opening up to anyone. Just wave your hand, and I'll call on you to present your comments or pose your questions. So, anyone to go first? Don't be shy. Who's there? Is that you, Sheikh Salim? You have a question to ask? Or comment to make?
I have a comment to make,
okay.
if you don't mind. Thank you very, very much. I enjoyed that very, very much. The last speaker certainly resonates more with us, with me particularly, because we have shared, and we continue to share, a similar pain.
Just can I just interrupt for people who are not aware? Sheikh Salim, Sheikh is talking from Johannesburg. Of course, he has a South African background, just to put that into context. Go ahead, please, Sheikh Salim.
Thank you. And I'm a humanist, and I'm all for forgiveness. And in my day-to-day affairs, I think that if one doesn't forgive, you remain a victim. That said, there also then seems to appear in life a situation where forgiveness cannot simply be willy-nilly conferred upon the aggrieved. In South Africa, that is particularly true. We have had an atrocious system. And I see America repeating it. We don't have that sort of racism in South Africa today. It is an unfortunate thing, and I hope I'm not going to offend anybody, but my lived experience tells me that the Black man has an enormous capacity to forgive. You must understand that 52 years of absolute pure hatred, right down to the smallest thing that's been planned. My son, who is a stand-up comedian, took me on a tour one day when I spoke about a South Africa that is apartheid in reverse. And he said, "Come, old man, I'm going to show you something." We got into the car and we drove around, and he showed me our neighborhood with the beautiful jacarandas in bloom. And he said, "You think they're lovely?" And I said, "Oh, fantastic." He says, "Okay, can we go to the other street? Look at that. Wow, great." He says, "Now we're going to go for a drive." And we drive into Soweto, Kliptown, where I was born. And there's not a tree in sight. And when we go to El Dorado Park, where the colored people live, not a tree in sight. And when we go to Bosmond, where the upper markets of the colored people and Malay people live, there are trees, but the eucalyptus. And then he looked at me, we stopped, and he said, "You see, Dad, they even had the temerity to think about designing what brown and black people should have as trees. They even denied us the beauty of a neighborhood." So today, in South Africa, because of a very corrupt ANC, no excuses, they are probably the worst in the world. Each one of them. The black people of South Africa are tainted as, why do we not have restorative justice? Forgiveness cannot take place without restorative justice being seen to be given and meted out to victims. What we've got in South Africa is this pseudo rainbow Japanese wand, that the rich move to the north and they call black people my brother and my sister. Some of them do, but black people still, by and large, remain your checkers. The checkout point at supermarkets and the garage and petrol attendants, etc. Our education is unequal. Our hospitals are unequal. So forgiveness, while it seems it's such a wonderful human attribute, and I started earlier by saying that I really find that if you can't forgive, then you suffer more. I absolutely bow to the black man in South Africa who can still look at a white man today and smile and laugh as they all do. I think their ability to forgive stands head and shoulders above humanity. And I'm very proud for being part of that process.
Thank you, Sheikh.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll come back to you later if need be. Anyone else, please, in comments, questions to any of the speakers, just point out who you wish to respond to your question, or the whole panel to do so. Either you're all stunned by the presenters, or you're absorbing what they've been saying.
Dr. Taj, Eleni Meleritos wants to ask a question.
Perfect. Thank you for letting me. Eleni, go ahead. We can't hear you, Eleni.
Unmute, please.
Okay, unmute. I thought I unmuted everyone.
So,
Oh, yeah.
hello everyone.
Yes.
Good evening.
Yes.
I would just like to make a comment rather than a question. We heard from one of the speakers answering to your last question, Dr. Hargi,
Yes.
about the concept of forgiveness in in their faith, and the response was that how can we forgive if still slavery is going on? How can we forgive if wars are still going on? There's so much injustice in this world. And yes, that's true. But there will never be a time that there will be absolute justice in this world. We live in a fallen world. So if we wait for that day, we will never forgive, I'm thinking. And how could we reconcile, with the fallen world? So what I'm just suggesting or just commenting is that maybe this is more of a personal level procedure rather than a general, big picture procedure, because, we want to put our heart at peace. That's what forgiveness is. Just because I happen to be Greek, the word forgive in Greek is translated in English not as forgiveness. The word is synchoro. It's a compound word. Synchoro means I coexist, because what conflict does, depending of course on the level of the conflict, what it does, division occurs when there is a conflict. So the two people that are involved or more, they're just in different spaces, in different areas, right? So there's no conversation. So forgiveness is coexist, which suggests that what happens, let me find the right word. English is not my mother tongue. So what I understand is that the application, let me say this way, of forgiveness is to try to find a common space with the person that has done wrong against me, or vice versa. So there can be reconciliation and restitution. And our brother Dan McVeigh, who happens to be part of this discussion, talked to us last year. He was here in Greece, and it was so wonderful to explain, because we are in a congregation here that is made of Christians, we have a lot of Muslim people that are part of our community. And we have people from Kurdistan. You know, there's a lot of conflict with all these different nations. So what Dan McVeigh very skillfully told us is, yes, there can be restitution, there can be reconciliation and coexistence, because we experience that. However, every time we reconcile and every time we try to forgive, you know, and coexist, we never will be like it was before. We are in a different place. Because, you know, some people think if they forgive, then they're going to be friends again. They're going to be in the same place they were when they start, you know, before. But no, it's a new place. It's a new reality. Everybody has moved on. So in just a few words, I want to say that I see forgiveness as a very personal procedure, and that to make it practical and applicable is to find a common space with the person that we have the conflict, and there can be coexistence again under different circumstances and different terms, but again, you know, we can coexist.
Thank you for your comments. Let me just
I'm sorry, I cannot hear you now.
Okay. Okay.
No, we hear you. Oh, no, now we don't. Now we don't. Okay.
I don't know how this works because we're from different democracies and cultures, and it is considered rude in my culture just to step in without being allowed to speak up. So please forgive me. That's the first part. Dr. Bryce, Smith Bryce, I greet you from across the ocean. I feel your love, I feel your energy, and I feel that you're my sister, although we are miles apart and oceans apart. I will use South Africa as a reference point, and I'll use my own culture as the base upon which I will give my input on this. I'm from the Nguni group called the Zulu people, and we have a concept of Ubuntu. Ubuntu means humanity. And when properly expressed, it means I am for you are, all right? So when you trespass against me and I have to forgive you, well, there are several things that need to happen. Firstly, you need to acknowledge what you've done wrong. Acknowledgement means that you say this in public. There's got to be a symbolic or a literal act of penance on your part. I think the book of Numbers says that if you take one thing from somebody, you repay it for so many times. Now, in the Zulu culture, we've even got an expression that says, if you and I are engaged or involved in a fight, we go to the riverside and we wash each other's wounds. That's the physical acknowledgement of what I've done to you. I can't just say, I am sorry that I've hurt you. I've got to clean your wounds. I've got to dress up your wounds and show through an act of penance, of submission and humility that I have wronged you. That is the second part of how we do things. That gives both the perpetrator and the victim, at least at a superficial level, some form of closure. The third part is that you don't repeat the same mistake. You don't remind the other person that you apologized. Nor should you remind the other person that you forgave them, right? Remember, I cannot be if you are not. So by forgiving you and by letting go, I am also releasing my own energy. I am also allowing myself to grow as a person, all right? Now, in our modern society, and I think one of the earlier speakers referred to South Africa's transition from the horrible system of apartheid to where we are, and he remarked on how we embarked on that journey. There are a couple of flaws with that process that emerged. One of them is that it was forgiveness without reparation. Reparation, not materialistic reparation, not giving away your own wealth or anything like that. Just acknowledge the damage that was caused to a generation of a people. That's the first thing. The other thing is when you ask for forgiveness, you tell the truth. You own up to what you did to that person. Remember the washing of wounds that I spoke about earlier. That's what we should have done as a country. We have gone through a process where, because of humanity, we chose to forgive people. The country could have been literally, could have gone up in flames, but we chose the higher route where we forgave. But the problem with that forgiveness process is that the generational trauma is still being visited upon our children and their children's children. the inequalities that were visited upon our parents are still visible even in our way of life today. The mere fact that we talk about forgiveness as though it's an automatic process. I think, especially in South Africa, it's not necessarily the case. We have people who are patient, and I think it's one of the American poets, his name escapes me, he says that if a dream is deferred, at some point it will rot and something bad's going to happen. Now, when you talk about reconciliation and truth and forgiveness, from a personal level, when I do something wrong, I'm not talking about big symbolic things, I'm just talking about at a personal level. Firstly, I see you as a human being. I apologize. I treat you the way that I would have wanted to be treated. And when I do make amends, I do it in a way that makes sense to both you and I, in a way that gives you, the victim, some form of closure, but also gives me, the perpetrator, some form of lesson. That's how I believe that in the Abrahamic religion, which is partly an African way of doing things, is that we both learn from this. We come back from the river, both of us wet with our hands with blood, to show that we made peace. And I think in our instance in South Africa, we just missed that one tiny step, which today is still giving us some nightmares. But that's my 2 pence worth.
Beautiful.
Dr. Taj, we cannot hear you.
Oh, sorry.
No.
Okay. Thank you for those comments. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for those comments. I would like to ask the 4 panelists now to make some comments about the remarks made by our previous commentators. So go ahead in any order, the 4 panelists, please.
Thanks, Dr. Taj. Oh, okay. No, go ahead. Go ahead, Sheikh.
I was just going to say where one of the first commentator was saying about being personal. I think it needs to be personal and collective, because not all actions are personal against individuals. Sometimes crimes can be perpetrated against communities and against countries. So you can't take that on a personal level. And simply, the simple reason for that is because peace at any price is no peace at all. If you just accept something as an individual, then how are you going to reconcile it for a whole community? It's not possible to do that. And because not all conflicts are individual, no, they can be collective as well. So you have to hold people accountable for what they do, whether it's individual or as a nation.
Rabbi Greg?
So I think it's a comment, and then I have a question. So to Sheikh Salim and to Dumasani, a big resounding yes. Absolutely. I think that you've both spoken about, oh, by the way, the poem I think is Harlem by Langston Hughes. Is that right? Yeah. So
That's right.
was a fan. So Dumasani, you mentioned Ubuntu, and you said that the full Mazulu is not great, but Umuntu, Ngumuntu, Ngabantu, that a person is a person through other people, doesn't necessarily require that generosity of spirit, which is beautiful, and so both of you and Sheikh Salim spoke about that, and I think it's beautiful to invite that generosity of spirit, but if it blocks or it masks the process of justice, then it's not going to be helpful in the long term. If it's an opening door to a deeper and more meaningful process that will be much more painful, then that's beautiful. It's the invitation in. But I think what happened in South Africa is we took the generosity as the end. Okay, done. Everybody's happy. Let's go forward. As opposed to, wow, isn't this incredible that everybody is willing to sit down at the table? Now let's do the work. Let's go into the painful space of doing the hard work, because we have the generosity of spirit to allow the work to be done. So then my question is, and that can be to any of the Christians who would like to help me, is this Matthew chapter 6 verse 14. you know, it's beautiful to say that one should forgive, but I don't think that Matthew is saying forgive without process or forgive without requirements. Forgiveness is beautiful as an end, but what about the process towards that forgiveness?
Good. I just want to say that I'll come to Halima. She's got a hand raised, but let's first go to Dr. Smith-Bryce and then to Bishop Rusudan to give their comments at this stage. Dr. Smith-Bryce?
Yes, and my brother Dumasani, yes, thank you so much for your thoughts and your comments. Yeah, I still struggle with this concept of forgiveness, just because in our current state, in the U.S., it is those who profess to be Christian, particularly those who are white evangelical Christians, who are leading the charge to maintain this system of sin. That it's almost a life and death thing for them. And so it's difficult to really be able to come to terms and grapple with this notion of reparations and reconciliation, even the notion of people even acknowledging that the thing is what it is, that it is a sin, because it's wrapped up in their white Jesus. And so that's a whole different, you know, concept. And I really don't have a whole lot of hope around that as it relates to how we do what we do here in this country. And so anyway, that's what I want to say for now.
Okay, thank you. Bishop Rusudan, before I get to some of the questions, questioners.
So about Matthew 6:14, we speak about forgiveness, but forgiveness is preceded by repentance. So there is this process. So God knows our hearts. God knows what we need. God knows what we did. But God is waiting for our first step to repent, to acknowledge what we have done, what was wrong. So absolutely, I agree with Rabbi Craig that that there is this huge, painful but healing process within these words, what Matthew describes. So every time we try to kind of jump to the last step just to avoid the punishment, that's not the forgiveness. That's if you do not go through the process, that's not forgiveness. It's this humiliation of the victim, of diminishing all the pains the victim has been through. So to value people, to respect the history, everybody needs to go through this process.
Thank you, Bishop Rusudan. Halima, are you there for your question? Halima? I don't know where she is, but okay, anyone else? Maybe I should ask another theologian, Reverend John Whitcomb in Coventry. Would you like to add on to the discussion, or any comments or questions?
Oh yeah, thank you. Well, it's been great being part of the conversation here in Coventry. We have the Father Forgive text, which is really important in the ruins here, and a relationship with the Peace Cathedral in Tbilisi, which is how I heard about the event. So wonderful to listen to Bishop Rusudan, and I've not had the pleasure to do that before. And so I found the rabbi's presentation incredibly helpful and clear, and very good to go through those different stages of forgiveness. And of course, there are so many different perspectives about forgiveness in Christianity. So I am not a great devotee of the doctrine of an original sin. And so though obviously Augustine is very keen on that, it's not probably one of the traditions that I personally draw on really very strongly, though I have people in my own community probably who are would not share that perspective. They feel probably I should talk more about sin than I do. But I think the way that you've explored the importance of process, all the speakers, is unbelievably important. And of course, I'm quite familiar with the situation in South Africa, and our Coventry Cathedral community across the Nails quite aware of some of those challenges around the TRC in South Africa, and obviously the immense work of Bishop Tutu, but then some of the ongoing challenges, because that restoration part of things just seems to not have been there. I think Tutu himself thought it should be there. You probably heard that story about him talking the thing about bicycle theology, where he says, you know, if you steal my bicycle, you know, I might forgive you, but I still don't have a bicycle. And so actually something needs to be done about that. So I guess I'm just saying thank you. I've really appreciated listening to it and the different strands of the different traditions and how, in a sense, I think they all really belong together. So thanks for the welcome. Thanks, Dr. Taj, for inviting me to speak.
My pleasure. I hope to recruit you to be one of the speakers for future seminars. So that's why I wanted you to speak now. I can get an idea of your competency, which is actually very good. So I had an ulterior motive to ask you. Eleni mentioned Professor Dan McVeigh, and I think it's important he's on tonight as he's a participant. And so I would like to have his views about the presentations and about anything else that you would like to add to this very, very important question of compassion, forgiveness, clemency, and pardon. Professor McVeigh?
Thank you, Dr. Taj. It's been an enlightening exercise. I appreciate what all of the presenters have had to say. As the rabbi mentioned a moment ago, wishing to hear maybe from the Christian perspective, what I would like to add is when we read the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 and later in Matthew chapter 18, he talked about forgiveness. He said, if you come to the altar to worship and you know that you have offended someone, he said, stop your worship, go to that person, sort it out. And then in Matthew 18, he said, if someone has done something against you, go to that person, talk to them. If they will not hear you, go and get other witnesses, bring them. So I think we can see that Jesus, at least, is also emphasizing the personal relationship and the engagement, and he puts the responsibility upon whether I am the offender or the offendee, the offended. I have the responsibility to take action. So even though it begins at a personal level, it must reach a higher level than just myself to address the issues of wrong, injustice, et cetera, et cetera. So I believe you can find this, in the teachings of Jesus. I think forgiveness, to a large extent, is also on a personal level. To some extent, psychologically, it's choosing how we remember the past and how we let it dominate who we are. It's recognizing wrongs and injustices, but choosing to move forward, as Eleni was talking earlier, moving to a new place. When God forgives us, hopefully we've learned from the experience and we've moved to a new place in our relationship with God. And so this perhaps can be an ideal or a goal in our relationships with others, to move to something new. But it requires action. It requires engagement. And thus, the larger the crime or the offense, the more engagement it's going to involve, I think. So I think from the Christian tradition, there is a strong principle of not just keeping forgiveness at a personal level, but going to the next levels, going to the social aspects and the broader pictures. And I think that's where it becomes challenging. And another perspective I think we're taught in the scriptures as Christians is we are not to seek to take the place of God. Vengeance belongs to God, as we read in scripture throughout. I'm sure that's been mentioned. I missed the beginning of the program. So part of learning to forgive or trying to forgive is abdicating ourselves from trying to claim the position of God, and yet it is not an abdication of social responsibility, which would involve, I think, restitution and reparation.
Thank you, Dan, for very thoughtful remarks. I want to call on Marcia Raymond. I believe she's a student of theology, and we would love to have her comments or remarks about this evening's presentations. Marcia? Can you unmute?
Trying to unmute. I don't know where you got the idea I'm a student of theology. I'm not a student of theology.
My informant has misinformed me.
Come on,
Yeah.
Marcia, you study all the time. You study everything.
Oh gosh, yes, all right. That's one way of putting it.
You're a compulsive student. You never stop studying.
Everybody with great interest. And I'm not sure if I'm right or wrong. I don't normally like talking in these things because I'm not always right. One of the things that I didn't pick up was that the person doing the forgiving, that forgiveness can only come about when you have really understood the motive of what is the meaning, the motive of the perpetrator against you. Once you understand what got that person to do what they are doing, then surely it's easier to, the forgiveness is more real. And that's my only comment.
All right.
I don't know if that was what people were saying, but certainly it's the one thing that is important for me.
Okay. Anyone else wants to comment and contribute at this point? Floor is yours. Or any of the panelists want to say things whilst people are collecting their thoughts?
Dr. Taj, I think Tersha had her hand up.
Okay, Tesha, sorry, I didn't see that. Go for it.
I'd like to, just as a blanket statement, perhaps say that one of the things I think is that what we need in the world is more shalom. And what I mean by shalom is the definition by an author, Cornelius Plantinga Jr., who wrote an excellent book on sin called Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, a Breviary of Sin. And he describes shalom as being basically how God would have wanted things to be. And one of the stories he illustrates is an incident that happened in America where a lady came home from work and she was about to enter the block of flats and she was attacked, and some of the lights went on in the flat windows and some people shouted and the guy left and the lights went off again and the guy came back and attacked her again. And this time people shouted a bit louder out the window, but nobody ever came to her rescue. And eventually she was crawling into the building. The attacker came back for a third time. At this time he killed her. But only when the attacker entered the building did people care to call the police, because then they feared for themselves. And this is not how it's supposed to be. This is not how things should be. And we've had numerous examples, and Dr. Bryce especially highlighted the way things should not be, that things have been and are the way they should not be. What we lack is the shalom. What we lack is God's order of things and how it ought to be. And when we, for example, when we seek first the kingdom, then we increase the worth of shalom in the world. So in the same, some speakers have said we can't hold people in present day accountable for what was done in the past, yet there needs to be justice. I think that every single person living today is responsible to increase the net worth of shalom in the world. So that's one statement I'd like to make. And there's an author called Ed Worthington, but he's also a researcher on the topic of forgiveness. He's done an enormous amount of research on forgiveness. It's a story of when his mother was brutally attacked, and he came home from a New Year's party to find the very, very brutal attack of his mother, and she had died. And he was walking around the house seeing evidence of this attack all over the place, and just understanding the brutality and severity. And he found himself wanting to kill the killer. He wanted to kill this person who had murdered his mother. And in a moment of realization, he suddenly just was no different to the murderer, because he himself wanted to murder as well. And he just came before God and first asked forgiveness for himself, before God for his own heart, his own sin. And in that process, he was able to start experiencing a level of empathy for the murderer. And only once he had some empathy was he able to forgive. And so empathy is also an important part of the process. Many forgiveness models that counselors apply would want to first lead you towards empathy before you can come close to forgiveness. So as most people have said tonight, the process is so important. It's not instant, it takes time. It's something very sensitive, and it's a delicate process. And empathy is one of those stages before one can forgive. And then something we haven't talked about tonight is self-forgiveness. The perpetrator who needs to get to a point of self-forgiveness as well. And that issue all on its own. But even there, the person needs to move from shame, which is actually selfish, because shame is just, oh, people are going to think badly of me now because I've been caught out for what I did. Shame achieves very little. The person needs to be moved from shame to guilt. And perhaps what people like Dr. Bryce want to see is a genuine guilt. And until there is a real guilt, there cannot be an understanding, true understanding of what has been violated, what needs to be fixed, how does it need to be fixed. And also, if one doesn't, then there's no guarantee that it won't happen again, you know. So all of these things are very interesting, and I appreciate the opportunity to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you. But since you've referred to Dr. Smith-Bryce in your comments, I think I would like to hear some response from you, Dr. Smith-Bryce.
I just want to be very brief and say I do appreciate those comments that you made. And again, with all of that you've just said, just the basics of acknowledging the sin, acknowledging the offense is required for all of those steps, even with self-forgiveness. And so we have to figure out a way to move people. Well, I guess it's not for us to figure it out, as you said. This is not the work of, we're not God, but the prayer should be, I believe, to that folks' hearts would just not be so hardened, to be opened up, to be able to acknowledge their sin, and then move towards those steps of forgiveness. So I appreciate your comments.
Let me ask a question for Dumisani. I see he's raising his hand, but before your comment, Dumisani, my question, and you could incorporate it in the comment, the question you wanted to ask, is if you could wave a magic wand, and I think I liked your analysis of the South African situation, what would you do in the next 10 years, practically, for the whole country to move forward? You know, I'm not talking about la-di-da-di, airy-fairy stuff, but, you know, something practical and with a specific time frame, 10 years, 20 years, not something way, way out in the future, but something that we all can relate to.
Thank you, Doc, for the challenge. I will respond as I allow my brain's oils to get warmed up. I just wanted to say something, that it doesn't matter what the God of understanding is called, whether he is Allah, God, Umdali, the great architect of the universe, whatever you call him or her or it. The principle of forgiveness exists in any way of belief and religion. But it also requires a bit of repentance on the part of the perpetrator, which brings me to the self-forgiveness part. You see, if you learn to love yourself, to accept yourself, to embrace yourself, and with the amazing grace, whatever that is in your life is your guide, I promise you, you will find peace within yourself. And when you have peace with yourself, it is much easier for you to make peace with other human beings. At a practical level for the next 10 years, I think the first act of correcting what is wrong with our country, South Africa, is one, let's invest in the right things. It cannot be that in this day and age, we still have rampant corruption. It cannot be that children go to bed on an empty stomach while somebody is making millions of rands. I don't know what that is in your respective currency, but it's an obscene amount of money, all right?
Yes.
Let's invest in things like education, because if you educate people, if you empower people, you give them opportunities. And with opportunities, they can correct their own lives. They can write themselves. You cannot help everybody. But through investing the right things, such as fair and equal access to opportunities, I think is another way in which you can correct things. There's a difference between
I may interrupt you, Dumasani. Sheikh Salim had mentioned that, you know, with the rampant corruption by the ANC and so forth, how are we going to provide education for the deserving majority of people? When you have all of these state entrepreneurs, state capture, corruption everywhere. So the money that's supposed to be going for education, health, housing, all the stuff that the poor really needs is being dissipated. So how are we going to proceed for the next 10 years when money is still going into some people's pockets?
Well, this I can say on public record, because I've already said it within my own party, that up until last year, if you asked me which political party I was going to vote for, I'll tell you which party I was going to vote for. But going forward, I'm open to persuasion. So how do we correct this? Firstly, we get the government that we deserve, right? We are where we are because of the choice that we made. Some were made out of anger, some were made out of maybe passion and maybe unqualified reasons that we chose to go a certain path. But where we are, we have learned enough to make peace with our past, that we cannot hold on to what happened to us during apartheid period, that will always vote for one political party. I believe that there is a chance for us now to have a diversity of voices, a different way of doing things, and how that's going to be done. I'm not a politician, but I believe that we do have people who mean well and can do better than what we currently have. With regards to what we call tenderpreneurs and people who are taking advantage of the current situation in the country, we are reaping the fruits that we sowed years ago. We've never allowed a culture of proper entrepreneurship. We gave people tenders, we gave people forms to complete, and gave them contracts. We've never educated people to become natural business people. We have never allowed everyone's talent and abilities to thrive. We created a system where you're either rich or you're poor and nothing in between. And because of that, people chose the most rewarding of the two choices, which was just to make money from the state. But where we are, we have learned enough to self-correct. And self-correct doesn't mean that a leader from somewhere will come and tell us what should be done differently. We as a people will do differently. We will do better. In my personal space, I have given as much as I can. I have allowed people to thrive in spaces where they wouldn't have thrived. This is my own way of giving back to the community and to make sure that the next generation, my children's children and their children, do not have to go through what you're going through right now. And forgiveness means that when we let go, we let go. We don't use the past as a base upon which we make future decisions.
Thank you. That's a very effective recommendations, and I really hope for all South Africans that they take heed of what you're saying, and we could kill this cancer of corruption. And with that, South Africa, as we all know, is a fabulously wealthy country, but its wealth is being either monopolized by historic monopolists or now by the opportunist politicians and their lot. And the poor in the rural homelands and in the non-urban areas, they are suffering disproportionately than the ones in the urban areas. So clearly there's a lot to do. Anyone else want to comment about anything that you've heard, or ask the speaker something, or please go ahead. Balu, you are there. I know Balu always has questions. Balu, come on, Balu, we need you.
Hi, Dr. Taj. I think that being a fellow South African who feels also very, very much the pain of the injustice and the unreparation. And I am interested to know really practically what can be done from human to human level. I am more interested to know more detail about what could be done. And I suppose in America too, it's similar but different. But so I'm interested to know that.
Anyone wants to tackle Balu's question? Salim, can you answer Balu, please?
Oh yeah, certainly. Um, the amount of hate in religion, through religion, and monopoly of resource that has been visited upon the people of South Africa through generations. And despite that, and in spite of that, we have produced some of the finest doctors, judges, lawyers, teachers in the world. Speaks volume about the South African spirit. But my brother was right when he said that, and also Rabbi Greg was right, that when we had the bishop, my favorite man, Bishop Tutu, was too forgiving too quickly.
Yeah.
And the people that came out there were not really asking for forgiveness. What they were saying was, yeah, we did what we did, but it was somebody else who told us to do that. Now that's a cop-out, because you did what you did and you benefited completely. Maybe you didn't, you weren't a racist, but you benefited. You see, your child went to a school where he could get a private coach to coach him in cricket, and therefore he can play cricket for the national team. You lived in an area that was very close to your schools. I had to take a bus at 4 o'clock in the morning to get to my school. It starts at 7:30, 50 miles away. So there's a lot that you've done that was very, very ungodly in the first instance. There is no qist wal adla in this. In the second instance, you separated God, you made God white. You made your churches white. You told us to believe in a blonde and blue-eyed Jesus. We cannot now respond with love to Jesus, because he to us represents that which we most hate as a people. Despite that, the Ubuntu of the South African soul is so good that most Black people, brown people, people of color have really now forgiven to a large extent. And also equally, the process that is now 25 years old, today in 2020, there's a marked difference in how white people react and respond and interact with people of color. It is no longer like it used to be. In the area where I moved in, I bought a house, I was building it, painting it. My white neighbor came up and he says, listen, you know, I think you got to get rid of this rubble out here because it's destroying the neighborhood. So I looked at him and I said, but I'm building. And he says, yes, but you know, we need to clean these things out. And I said, look across the road. Look at all the other houses. Look what they look like. Why do you pick on mine? So we still have this kind of hatred. But I believe that it's a process, and we are at that stage now in this long process where South Africans, the young ones, are no longer seeing things in color. And there are friendships being formed across the line. What we need is for the perpetrators of this evil to collectively accept the responsibility that you visited an ungodly injustice on people only because of their color. Once you do that, you set yourself free. We are free already because we never really aspired to be you. We were quite happy in the color of our own skins. Now we can start again. We need your skills. We need to be a country that can work together. And yes, we need a new political party. We need a party that is representative of all kinds and colors of South Africa, as is happening among our youth in the clubs. It's in the streets. South Africa is a loving nation with loving people that love to laugh, and forgiveness comes very easily to us. Thank you.
With due respect,
I hope I've answered that.
with due respect, Sheikh Salim, I don't think you actually answered Balu's question. Balu wants to know.
Oh, sorry. She wants to know how are we going to?
Yes.
How are we going to?
Yeah, we don't want to discuss the illness of the patient. We know the illness.
Right.
We are now looking at the cure. How to find this cure in the next 10, 20 years, and not, 50 years or 100 years. People can't think that far. People like me need 10-year goal, 15-year, 20-year goal, something manageable.
Yeah. Okay. That again is not one size fits all. In advanced democracies, there are clear paths and patterns for which such redress can be achieved. We come from a level that's -0. So we are learning and making mistakes as we go along, and we've made terrible mistakes, all of us. And I am replying and responding by saying that South Africa today is so much further ahead in understanding its own problems, in looking at itself and seeing that, yes, we have criminals and crooks within our own ranks. And this euphoria of a liberation party that we've been sold was sold to us because we were so stupid and cut off from the rest of the world. We no longer are. Social media has also helped us in our awareness. We are now ready, and I believe that the next vote that's coming will vote in or vote out this ruling monolithic ANC, and by giving us a new representative government, we are now in a very good space to move forward, because both white people and black people have defined who we are, and we no longer have a problem with that. It did take 20 years. Maybe we could say it should have taken 15 years. But it could also have taken 50 years had we decided to go to war. So the road ahead is a good one for us. Right now, the only thing that is stopping South Africans from loving each other is actually our government. We've had COVID, and during COVID, the Jewish community stood up, the Christian community stood up, white people handed out parcels of food to black people in lines. No, we have the forgiveness now. We have this Ubuntu. It's soaking into the souls of us. All we need is to replace a tyrannical, corrupt government, and we will be well ahead on our way to parity.
Yeah. Anyone else want to comment?
I think I've answered it now.
Yeah, you have. I don't know. Balu, do you think he has answered that?
Dr. Taj, always on the spot. I think it is so interesting, all of it, even if it's not, I don't think there's one unequivocal answer, but I just want to comment that I do think, I've read, I'm very close to Dr. Mampila Rampele, and I've read a lot about Steve Biko, and I've been to the Steve Biko Center. And just as one person, and there were millions that were murdered, hung, who supposedly committed suicide, even that alone, there's no real memorial. There's no memorial to all these unbelievable activists who just disappeared. And the amount of people that had to leave the country, we've been so robbed. And I'm a Jew, and in terms of Nazi Germany, even going to Berlin, there are so many memorials. Mm-hmm. And that is one thing I think South Africa really, really should be doing. We should be doing, is at least acknowledging and having incredible tributes that people can be learning. A lot of the young people don't even know the whole history and story.
Yeah, you're quite right. And I think, with the Black Lives Matter movement, they've been taking down statues in the United States, and maybe rightly so. In South Africa, we need to erect a whole bunch for all of our heroes and people known and unknown. And, for example, in Britain, they have a statue to the unknown soldier. We could also do that to all the unknown people that suffered and were killed brutally by the security police in the 50-odd years of Nationalist Party government. clearly.
Can I comment on that?
Marcia, go for it.
Just for context, those statues that we're demanding to be taken down were erected in the 50s as a form of intimidation. They
Right.
were put there directly after the Civil War.
Yes.
So they're not in allegiance to anything but white supremacy. So those are the statues that are being that are being demanded to be taken down, not just random.
No, we understand that. But you have a process where you're bringing down statues, rightly so. In South Africa, I think Balo and I would agree that we need to start erecting these memorials to all of our heroes. You know, the unsung men and women that gave their lives for us to be free today in South Africa.
Add something here from post-Soviet experience.
Yes, Bishop Ruslan, what do you want to talk about the post-Soviet experience?
We have very, very odd situation here. There are a lot of lessons that can be learned from Holocaust experience, for instance, how they have apologetic or how the forgiveness or asking for forgiveness, the process took place. But this huge system, criminal system, just disappeared without anybody to blame. We had the statues taken down. I was a teenager when these huge Lenins and Stalins and Orjonikidze statues were taken away from the central squares of Tbilisi, and we thought that's it, but that's not enough. Because we did not change the educational system. We still study the history the way it was taught during the Soviet times. We have not re-evaluated anything. And in our situation, we didn't have even racial differences. The people who are the part of the system are still here, are part of the society. We cannot even put the finger because somebody is black, somebody is white. They burned their communist licenses and the archives were burned down, and the archives have disappeared. So we do not have who have been involved in the systematic crime. So now what we have is that everything just disappeared. The new generation, my children's generation, are supposed to study what have happened during the 70 years of communism, during the 30 years of post-Soviet regime, which really continued the same systems in everything. Just the ideology was kind of replaced from communism into a nationalism or national Christian orthodoxy or whatever. So I think the lessons what can be learned from each other's experiences is symbolic actions are very important. That taking away the statues is important. Erecting the new statues is important, but studying the history, studying the mistakes is very important.
Yeah,
something what we as post-Soviet nation are missing is studying our history. And probably that can be one of the ways to deal with the forgiveness.
It's a good idea.
Okay, we now need to bring this to a close. I'm sure we can go on forever, but before I'm asking each of the panelists to give a brief comment, concluding remarks, are there any last minute questions, remarks from the audience, from any of the participants? Shahid, anything to say there? Zubair, Uti Ben Yusuf, anyone who wants to speak?
Yeah, Dr. Taj, I want to say something.
Hi, Jabin, yes.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that change is from grassroots, and that you start with your young, especially if you're talking about 10 years from now. You start educating your young in school. You know, talk about current affairs, talk about the reality of what's happening in the world today, so that when they become adult, they're not going to be the future perpetrators. You know, because they should they should learn to balance between what is right and what is wrong, not that money is the most powerful thing and that should be your objective, but what about what's happening in the world, human rights, people are being persecuted, killed, there's genocides taking place. What are we doing about it? This sort of thing needs to be from grassroots, not at university level.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We need to start when they're nappies, when they're in diapers, and to bring these things, this kind of awareness.
Probably primary school.
Yeah.
Probably primary school, but they're mature enough.
Earlier. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone else commenting? Marcia, go for it.
I was going to say, getting back to this country, I remember so very clearly some years ago, one of the very strong activists, I can't remember who it was, said, and her words were, "The struggle is not over." But at no stage is there still space for us to do what we did before, to bring apartheid down? Is there still this kind of activism needed in the same way, and would people all join in it? And that's just a question. But interestingly enough, I don't know if you know, Dr. Leonard Saransky was doing a U3A course, and the subject was prejudice and discrimination. And I realized how people are still finding it difficult to acknowledge their prejudice and their discrimination that they were acting. And it's something that we need to really examine ourselves and look deeply into ourselves to see what part we played and what we need to do now.
Thank you. Uti bin Yusuf?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Touch. I just want to thank you for this wonderful evening in which I gained so much. You called up my name, and during today, while I listened to this, I thought of somebody who had nothing to do with apartheid and nothing to do with the Holocaust or anything like that. He lived 8 centuries ago. His name was Dante Alighieri, the Italian poet. In his Inferno, there were these levels of hell through which he went, and he said the darkest places in hell are reserved for those who maintain their neutrality in times of moral crisis. And this, as a white person, I think that I am guilty of. And what really touched me very deeply was what Dr. Paiga Mustafa said tonight, that that we have to reach a stage through education, as you said, through the political difference, that those who do not suffer as much as those who do. And I think this is what I'm taking home tonight with myself. This is where I'm going to strive towards and teach my grandchildren. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. I think we've all learned greatly, and I'm so touched that you're taking this message home, and according to Jabin, teaching the young people first, so that we can bring a generation up that will be just and will be compassionate and will try to strive to give equal rights and equal respect for everyone. Any other final comments before we conclude? Then I'll be asking shortly the 4 speakers to make their final statements. Anyone else? Zubair, Shahid, who else is there?
Yeah. Dr. Taj, yeah. It was a very, very interesting whole program. I think I commend all 4 speakers. I suppose what I take away is that, justice has to be the baseline, but we have to balance that with something what Mahatma Gandhi said, an eye for an eye and the whole world goes blind. So we have to sort of stop somewhere and forgive. That's all. Thank you. to all the speakers.
Very good, pertinent remark. All right, I think we've gone way over time. I hope it's been a useful session for everyone and been beneficial, and we take something home, as Ute is saying, and that we can reform and redress the situation in our own lives. So now I call on the reverse order for people.
Dr. Taj, Najud wants to say something.
Sorry, Najud. Okay, I didn't see that. Najud, quickly. Not quickly, but the floor is yours.
Yeah, hello. I'd like to ask any of the panelists, do you think that part of the reason why we find it so hard to forgive is because we have an us versus them mentality? So instead of, like, for example, obviously not denying the crimes that were perpetrated against certain sects of humanity, but where we see all of them as the other, do you think that's causing also a kind of difficulty for us to move on?
Well, before I ask the question, pose a question to the panelists, are there any other questions? And then we can get the panelists to answer these final questions and also give their concluding remarks. Okay, if there isn't, we'll start in the reverse order with Dr. Smith-Bryce, then with Sheikh Paigam Mustafa, then with Bishop Rushadan, and finally with Rabbi Greg.
So to answer the question, this is just my thoughts. I think it's more than us versus them. I think it's about recognizing who's human and who, in this concept of who's not. And so when we look historically, globally, at anti-Blackness, that it is about we are not human. And so it's easy to mistreat non-humans. And so that's that. I wholeheartily believe that and see that throughout. And you know, of course, the literature, you know, there's lots of data to support that. It's what folks have written about unapologetically, and it is what it is. But I want to say as my closing remark that I'm very thankful for being included in this discussion. I don't know what made my brother Dan think that I was up for this, given the other panelists and how amazing they are. But I am very grateful for having been asked, and I hope that I can continue to be a part of these conversations.
You've been a star tonight, so I'm very pleased for Professor Dan to introduce you to us, and I'm so very pleased that we've had a really honest African-American perspective, which is much needed. So thank you, Dr. Smith-Bryce. It's our pleasure having you. I hope you'll join us in future as well. Paigam Mustafa, answer the question of Najud, and then any concluding remarks.
Well, all I would like to say is I think it's been a very engaging and interesting
presentation. Paigam, you're going to answer Najud's question. She's posed the question about them and us.
Can you repeat the question?
Repeat the question, please.
Yeah, I wanted to know if the us versus them mentality, and since I don't know if you're as a fellow Muslim also, because as you know, a lot of Muslims are finding it hard to forgive, you know, the colonists and all the people who are against Muslims, and so I was wondering what you feel about that. Is it sometimes we divide too much between us and them, forgetting that regardless of race, religion, there's good and bad on all sides?
Well, yes, I agree with you. I think there seems to be an us and them mentality. I think, as I've said in the previous presentation which I gave, people are tribal by nature, and there's always an us and them. And this is something that we have to stop before we can reconcile, because everybody, no matter which background or they come from, or whatever religion they come from, the values we need are the same. We don't need an us and them policy. We need something that will integrate us and assimilate us together, rather than having this segregation that we have in our mentality. So other than that, I would like to say it's been very engaging, and I think we need to take a message from everything which the other speaker said as well. Everybody said something which is very, very useful, and we can take some productive and useful message home.
Thank you. And now Bishop Rushadan, answer Najud's question, please, and then any concluding remarks and comments.
When I thought how to answer that particular question, it reminded me a conversation between myself and my friend. My friend is an expert on conflicts and negotiations, and I would work on domestic violence, women's rights and everything. And we could never come to a common ground when discussing the issues. She would speak about the violence from the conflict perspective. When there is a conflict, you speak that there are goods and bads on both sides. There are responsibilities on both sides, and it's very clear and very, very healthy approach how to deal with the conflict. But when you deal with the violence, you cannot say that probably those black people have done something wrong. That's why the white would treat them not as equal humans. Or there have been so many examples why the Jews we're treated the way they were treated for centuries, because we are blamed in a lot of things. So when there is this some supreme power is oppressing somebody who is sidelined, here we cannot really speak about the goods and bads on both sides, because until they are on equal level, then that's what I tried to explain in my presentation, that there are different approaches in violence and in conflict. When there is violence, when there is discrimination, then the somebody who is discriminated, somebody who is offended, they need a support. And to finalize, I just want to thank Dr. Touch for this beautiful opportunity to listen to all these wonderful people. And I'm taking a lot of wisdoms, a lot of phrases, a lot of approaches for my future work. It's so amazing to observe that even if the situations are very different from South Africa to the United States or the Europe or Eastern Europe or post-Soviet countries, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or whatever, there is this common pattern of forgiveness or healing the wounds. It's a process. And every time there is a wound, there are different kinds of wounds, but the commonality is that this is a process. And it requires everybody's effort to heal the wound. So whether it's studying the history, revising the values, or understanding the mistakes. It's very often in my trainings on diversity or tolerance, I would do the exercise on privileged steps, so that some people of the society are in a more privileged area and some are in somewhere backwards. And it's very interesting that those who are on a privileged level, they rarely understand how privileged they are or what is happening behind them. And very often I would find myself being in the majority in my country as an ethnically Georgian, or being a Christian in my country as a majority representative of majority religion so often, or being a heterosexual or whatever majority I belong to, I so very often cannot see what is happening behind me. So this is what I teach to myself and teach to my students, to be aware what is happening behind you, to understand how privileged you are, and especially if the system you are part of is not the equal system, if the system is a discriminatory system. So thank you everybody for your contribution.
Thank you, Bishop Richardson, for your very insightful remarks. And finally, my dear friend Rabbi Greg from Cape Town, to answer Jude first, and then your concluding remarks.
I got you. Well, first, before I answer, I just also have to say that I've learned so much from my colleagues on the panel, but I have to say I've learned as much from the participants in this Zoom call, and that's fantastic. I sometimes joke that some of these Zoom calls are like watching goldfish, because there's just these windows with and no participation or insight coming. I'm supposed to provide the intelligent edutainment, and everybody else is there just to imbibe it. And what's been fantastic tonight is I've been challenged and learned so much from everybody here. So thank you, Dr. Chad, for that. Najood, your question is a good one. I think that there's nothing inherently wrong with the perception of us and them. I think that there is a value. Each of us is created in the image of God, but each of us is different. And I think there's a value in us gathering around, as the Sheikh said, tribal identities. I think it's okay to gather as Jews or as Muslims or as Christians. I think it's okay to gather in women's groups. I think it's okay to gather as supporters of Manchester United, even though I haven't a clue why people do that. But I think that where the possibility for forgiveness becomes a problem is when, and here I'm borrowing from the philosopher Martin Buber, is when we see the you as you and not as thou. When we forget that the you that is different to me is also divine. So the blessing that I want to wish for all of us is to go back to Tertia, quoting Shalom. You know, Shalom comes from the Hebrew word Shalem or Shlemut, which means wholeness or completion. So when we want, it's usually translated as peace, but if we want peace, we usually think of an absence of war. What Shalom says is peace is a full wholeness and completion of the world as God intended it to be. And that's the blessing that I'd like to wish all of us.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Greg. So before we conclude, just two brief announcements. Firstly, this webinar is being recorded. We will upload it onto YouTube in the next day or two. And we'll send out the URL so that you could watch yourself, or maybe send on to other people who may be interested to view this. Just to give you a heads up, on the 30th September, our next webinar deals with the concept of charity. Is charity something that's benevolent, or does it foster patronage and dependency? And I think that we would like to hear the three perspectives: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And again, I think it's a fairly important topic, because some people say, especially in the African context, that when you give charity in Africa, you're only encouraging a dependency culture, and people don't actually move beyond that. And is that true or false? And what do the various religions say about this? So that's for next month, 30th September. Bookmark it if you're interested, and tell friends and others to tune in. So goodbye everyone tonight, and thank you all the panelists. Give a round of applause to everyone. They've done a great job, the speakers, the questioners, the commentators, and so forth. And I think it's been a useful 2.5 hours or more, and better than watching paint dry. Thank you very much. Okay, everyone, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.